Greetings, 11th graders. We are going to jump in here on our second to last Edpuzzle lecture. Next week is the last week that you will have class with me, and this will wrap us all up. So this week we're going to talk about the Cold War, and next week we're going to finish up talking about the Cold War. We will not be talking about World War II this year in no small part because we covered World War II pretty extensively last year. So the Cold War. From the end of World War II, so 1945 to 1991, the United States and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, which would be modern-day Russia and their supporting states, used a variety of strategies to try to win the Cold War. Right, and the Cold War is not a war in the sense that we think of wars where boots on the ground, people fighting against each other on both sides. The Cold War is essentially called the Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union never directly go to war with each other, right? And you can see on this map a number of different regional wars. Green would be anti-communist forces, communist forces would be in purple, and then everybody who's neutral is in yellow. So, the early years of the Cold War, which would be the first 4 years, so 45 to 1949, the United States used a containment policy to try to successfully stop the spread of communism, and this works, right? They try to keep communism from spreading in Europe, and they do a pretty good job of it with their containment policy. And you can see here, again, in purple and in pink, those countries that become communist, and then you can see in green the countries that do not. Russia is putting pressure on Turkey, and the United States, through the Truman Doctrine, and we talked about this last year too, tries to keep Russia from taking over there. And then there's also the Marshall Plan, in which the United States throws huge amounts of investment money into Europe to try to keep the Soviet Union from taking over and getting those countries to fall to communism. The United States props a lot of these countries up with finances. And here you can see NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is, again, another organization put together to try to stop the spread of communist Russian influence. And here are the members of NATO. And here you can see a map of the Berlin airlift. So Berlin, of course, you can see here is stuck on the inside of East Germany. East Germany is part of, as you can see, the communist bloc. And Russia, under Joseph Stalin, tried to cut off East Berlin. And the United States and Britain and France, but mostly the United States, at great expense, fly food into East Berlin so that East Berlin can stay, so that people don't starve to death, and East Berlin does not need to fall. Sorry, West Berlin does not need to fall to the Soviet Union. So West Berlin is Allied, East Berlin is Soviet Union. So communism then spreads to China in 1945, and the United States is fearing something they call the domino theory, or the domino effect, right? And this becomes more aggressive and the United States becomes more aggressive in their efforts to stop communism. And the domino effect, or the domino theory, is something that, just hearing it, you probably know what it is, right? If one country falls to communism, then like dominoes, another country will fall, and then another country will fall, and another country will fall, right? So that's the domino effect. So the USA goes to war in Korea to defend South Korea from communism, right? North Korea, which is supposedly communist, but they also have there's some other stuff going on there too. But communist North Korea, with aid from China and more so from the Soviet Union, invade South Korea, right? So the Soviet Union is supplying weapons to the communists of North Korea during the war, and you end up with this sort of indirect fight, right, between the USA and the USSR. And this is called a proxy war. And there are a lot of different proxy wars that take place during the Cold War, right? The United States doesn't directly go to war with Soviet Russia, but they do go to war with North Korea. The Soviet Union doesn't directly go to war with the United States, but they do go to war with Afghanistan. And then the United States provides Afghanistan with weapons in the 80s. And we'll talk a little bit about that next week. Then we have the later stage of the war. From 1949 to 1970, the Cold War escalates as a result of a nuclear arms race, a space race, and an espionage, so spying as well. So there's a lot going on. Um, and the United States had, for the first 4 years, right, from 1945 to 1949, a monopoly on nuclear weapons, right? Because we're the only ones who had them. The USSR successfully tests an atomic bomb in 1949, and now that ends that. Right now, the Soviets have a bomb, and the United States have a bomb. So, if these two countries go to war, there's a really good likelihood that nuclear weapons will be exchanged. Right, nuclear bombs will be exchanged, and they'll be thrown from one side to another. So the Soviet development of the atomic bomb leads to this arms race between the U.S. and the USSR, an attempt to build up more bombs than the other side, to build up so many bombs that the other side is unwilling to fight because it will mean their destruction. So in 1952, the U.S. Tests the first hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And the Soviet Union responds by detonating its own hydrogen bomb in 1953, so literally a year later. And by 1959, both the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics developed rockets called intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you no longer need an airplane to fly your bomb over an enemy city. Now you can fire off a rocket from the safety of your own country, and it'll deliver a nuclear warhead to distant targets. So the United States has the Titan, and then you can see on the right the Soviet missiles from that era as well. And then you can see here a Soviet transporter, a Erector launcher, or a TEL, which is literally a mobile missile launcher, right? So this thing drives out into position, and the missile stands up, and it can fire it off. By 1959, both of us, yeah, right, we already covered that. Not only that, but you also have submarines. The United States has the Polaris submarine, which is able to fire missiles, and so conceivably the Polaris submarine can get right up close to your enemy target and fire off missiles from anywhere that you can put a submarine in the water. And here you can see the MX missile, the W-87, which has multiple warheads on board. In the 1950s, United States President Eisenhower escalates the Cold War by using something called brinkmanship, threatening to use nuclear weapons and a willingness to go to the very brink of war with the Soviet Union. And if you look here, right, this map will show you sort of like where those missile bases are, where those air bases are, and potential nuclear attack between the Soviet Union and the United States would go over the North Pole, right? Right. So if the USSR attacks a NATO member, right, the United States would use massive retaliation and attack every major Soviet city and military target, essentially saying, if you do this, if you start this, you will be destroyed, right? And so you can see here from 1986 to 87, so this would have been about 33, 34 years ago, the United States number of intercontinental ballistic missiles versus the Soviets, right? 1,000 to 1,300. How many submarine-launched missiles? How many long-range bombers, right? How many nuclear warheads? Anti-ballistic missile launchers, aircraft carriers, and armed forces personnel. You can see these two sides are really building up. As a result, the USA and the Soviet Union are stockpiling nuclear weapons, building up their militaries, to intimidate the other side into leaving them alone. So with the USA and the USSR in possession of large nuclear stockpiles, each side can destroy the other, right? And this is called mutually assured destruction. If one side picks a fight, they're done, right? Both sides have enough nuclear weapons to not just wipe out the other side, but to detonate bombs on the surface, on every inch of the surface of Earth, right? They could literally destroy the entire world with the number of nuclear weapons that they have. So throughout the Cold War, the United States and the USSR are looking for ways that they can gain first strike capability, the ability to hit the other side first before the other side hits back. And what we end up with is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and this is a near nuclear war. It doesn't actually happen, but it's very close. Essentially, what happens is the Soviets put nuclear bombs in Cuba, ballistic missiles in Cuba. You'll notice that the United States, right, has helped Greece and Turkey defend against communism, right? We talked about that at the very beginning. And so those two places, you can bet that the United States has missiles located in Turkey, right? Missiles located in West Germany, missiles located in their allies up here. So the United States has missile sites all over very close to the Soviet Union, ready to strike on the Soviet Union. But you'll notice over here, the Soviet Union does not have missile sites close to the United States. So they try to put some missiles into Cuba. The United States says, you got to move those. The Soviet Union says, we're not going to. There's a big showdown, and eventually the Soviet Union does, in fact, remove their missiles. And the United States I think gives something back in response, but I can't remember exactly what it is. But it comes close, but it doesn't happen. The founding of Israel. So this happens during the Cold War, right? During and after World War II, thousands of Jewish refugees had left Europe for Palestine, right? Hitler's murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust shows the need for a homeland where Jews can live in safety. Unfortunately, there are already people living there. And so ethnic Arabs who are already living in that space are unhappy to be giving up land to Jewish people, begin attacking Jewish settlements. Unable to end the violence and exhausted by World War II, Britain withdraws from Palestine and turns the area over to the United Nations. So in 1947, the UN recommends that Palestine be partitioned or divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state. So there will be a state for the Jewish people and there'd be a state for the Arab people. Arabs, however, objected to giving up any of their territory to Jewish people, particularly because they're being expected to give up their best territory. So the best farmland, that sort of thing. When the last British troops leave Palestine in May of 1948, Jewish people announced the creation of the state of Israel. And then Israel wins recognition from global powers, from major world powers. And thus begins the Arab-Israeli War. The neighboring Arab countries see Israel as a creation of the Western powers who want to continue their domination of the Middle East. Vowing to destroy Israel, Arab nations declare war at once. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon send separate military forces against Israel, despite suffering heavy losses. Israel defends itself and defeats the divided Arab forces. But this is not the end, right? Essentially what ends up then is Palestinian refugees. More than 500,000 Arabs flee or are driven out of Palestine during and after the 1948 war. Many Palestinians end up settling in UN Israel, right? And you have camps, right? Refugee camps designed to be temporary, but soon they become home to several generations of Palestinians, in part because Arab and Palestinian leaders are refusing and resisting the idea of people leaving those camps. Because if they leave those refugee camps, right, they see this as an interpretation of a willingness to give up their goal of regaining a Palestinian homeland. So many Palestinians are encouraged to stay in these refugee camps for the rest of their lives, in order to not move out of Israel. Now, this conflict continues, and to this day, right? Since the 1948 war, the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors has erupted into 3 more wars. And while Israel wins each of these wars, its enemies are not entirely defeated, right? And how does this fit into the Cold War? Well, during the Cold War, the United States has provided military and economic aid to Israel, right? And Israel's Arab enemies, who are they going to turn to? If the United States is supporting Israel, the Arab enemies of Israel will turn to the Soviet Union for support. And that is exactly what they do. In 1964, the Palestinian leaders formed something called the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, to reclaim Palestine and destroy Israel. PLO activists waged guerrilla war against Israel, and by the 1970s, the PLO and other radical groups spread the Arab-Israeli conflict beyond the Middle East, right? They lash out at the United States and other nations that are supporting Israel. They use kidnappings, assassination, terror attacks to achieve their means. And you can see up here former PLO President Yasser Arafat. And so that struggle to maintain peace, right? Peace between Israel and the Arab world has been difficult. Over the years, several peace attempts have been made. President Jimmy Carter of the United States, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and Egyptian President Anwar el Sadat try to team up. Egypt agrees to recognize Israel in order to regain some lands that it had formerly lost. And the Arab world sees Egypt as betraying them, right? Sadat is assassinated 2 years later for what is seen by other members of the Arab world as a betrayal of all of their interests. So, World War II. What does World War II end up doing? Right, it increases these nationalist uprisings following World War One, and as a result of the global depression. Right, and what are the costs of empire? Right, the United States um, is supporting these anti-colonial liberation movements, um, which we will talk about next week. Right, and the Atlantic Charter of 1941. Which is the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they live. Um, and Soviets, of course, are also openly condemning colonialism, right? Because the world is full of countries who have been dominated, if you look at this map here, by Great Britain, France, Italy, and Belgium, and Portugal. And if you look particularly in Africa, particularly in Southern Asia, South Asia, and the South Pacific, there are a great number of countries, a great number of billions of people, right, who are living under um, governments that they did not choose for themselves, governments that were forced on them by this group of countries over here. So that's what we're going to talk about next week, and this is another important piece of the of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union would very much like these other countries rather than being controlled by these Western powers, to be controlled by the Soviet Union. And if they can break their control, the Western powers' control of these countries, the Soviet Union would stand to gain. So we're going to talk about that next week. If you have any questions about what we presented here, what we talked about here, you can contact me via office hours. You can also talk to me through email, and I will of course post this PowerPoint the alongside the Edpuzzle for this week's assignment. So again, any questions, feel free to contact me.